What is the rationale to try to give our students, let's call it peripheral, supportive skills beyond their ability to actually listen, whatever that might mean? What were some of the ideas that came out of your conversation? Please.
The independent learners.
Took
Yeah, I took it.
There are certain benefits of raising your hand early in the conversation. Okay, anyone else? Yes?
Creating a system for breaking down material and recording material.
I'm going to write processing, but it's probably more than that. Processing material, writing it down, understanding it.
That is before processing. Breaking down.
Breaking
Down material.
I would consider that to be part of the processing, actually. That's sort of how I'm defining it. But I can write breakdown, that's not a problem. For those who see it as different items. Breakdown, process, record, right? Have a system, have a structure, right? It's important because let's remember, assuming that we're using a summative assessment, which most of us do, there's probably a good 2-week gap in many cases between the initial content that you teach and the end of the unit. So you're asking me now to go back 2 weeks' time and remember information I wrote down a long time ago. If I don't have it well organized on my paper, it's a different language, and it's not very useful for me. Thank you. Yes?
If you teach the skills in the beginning, like,
Yes.
save time in the end because the kids
Okay.
end up learning
So-
quicker and absorbing everything quicker because they have the skills necessary.
I'll use a common expression. It's not really prevention per se, but the idea of investing a little bit at the beginning will expedite the process moving forward. Thank you. Yes?
And engaging the children's attention.
Is that from the teacher's angle or what the students can do? Tell me what you mean.
They'll be much more engaged in learning if they're going to be
It'll lead to increased engagement. Okay?
excitement. Let's change that.
And why do you say that?
Because changing from being a listening to being able to do something, so many times children are going to be much more engaged, much more.
Okay, so I'm hearing something called active learning, which I think is very valuable. Thank you. Okay. Anything else? Please.
I also think it's a life skill, the ability to listen and the ability to take responsibility for your own work.
Right. Right. We need to spend a lot of time thinking about, do we do enough in school to really prepare them for life? I shared at the last workshop that a professor of mine, actually, that was taking one course here in Schaumburg at Roosevelt University to finish a master's program. And so you might be familiar that in Schaumburg you also have Motorola. And this professor, it was actually a methodology class in social studies, and he told me that the conversation with the executive at Motorola went something along the lines of, you guys in education have it all wrong. Right? You don't know what you're doing. He said, what do you mean? He said, because in education, you're teaching students to think independently. You tell them that the conversation is a bad thing, no cheating, but it all has to be more work. Whereas in the real world, we all want engagement and collaboration and conversation. It's about producing products. It's not about taking tests. It's a totally different paradigm. Now that's a really different conversation, but you just opened up the beginnings of what could be really longer. Is school fundamentally a genuine preparatory portal, so to speak, or platform for life? And that's on many levels. Something to think about. Anyone else? Please.
I think it gives them a lot of confidence because a lot of times students either get it or they don't get, they succeed or they don't succeed, and then they don't necessarily feel like there's anything they could do about it.
Beautiful. Beautiful. I was thinking, for example, I'll take your point in just a second. I gave a workshop in Detroit before the school year began. Now, Detroit is similar in many ways to the layout of Chicago. It's flat, very Midwestern, grid-like, right? Not like some of the other places where I've lived or worked. And so driving there is not, relatively speaking, it's not that difficult. But I just remember going there and the way that I was positioned, I was driving somebody's car, so I didn't have a GPS with me, and I didn't have the benefit of anybody driving me. And I just remember the way that I'm sitting in the car. and I'm kind of a little bit further forward. Have you ever had this experience? And you're looking, where is that target they said that I need to find and make the next lap? And you're kind of up against the wheel, and you can't talk to anybody, and you're a little bit more tense perhaps, driving a lot slower than you normally would. That was my experience. Because if you don't really know where you're going, if you don't really have that sense of preparation, of that comfort, then your body shifts into what we call survival mode. Right? We need to know that the basics are in place. You can't engage, if you're familiar with the hierarchy of needs of Abraham Maslow, you know that you cannot engage up here until you've provided for the physiological needs down here. Right? Anyone who's taught on a fast day knows how difficult it is to teach on a fast day, how difficult it is to engage on a fast day. Because physiologically, the children are having a harder time. And they're not thinking about your lesson, they're thinking about their stomachs. Right? So imagine that as it relates to if they don't really know how to approach it, and they don't have a plan, so every day is sort of a new adventure. And while that can be interesting at times, it certainly doesn't necessarily lend itself to feeling comfortable in the context of the learning. Anyone else? Yes, thank you.
Study skills allow students to continue researching answers to their questions by giving them the next step in the learning process.
Okay, very nice. So, so they can, are you expressing the idea of like independence and the ability to take the next step?
Yes.
Okay. So I'll add it over here. That allows them to take that next step because they don't need the teacher necessarily. And isn't that nice? Creating this idea, isn't that really our goal anyway? Nobody wants that the students should be dependent on us for the rest of their lives, right? We don't want that our children, for example, when they grow up, that they're going to open up a text. Let's say they're opening up a Judaic text, Torah. You don't want them to have the translated version ideally. You want them to be independent learners, to be able to open up the original and to engage in it. And the same thing would be true with anything that we teach. The more that we can create independence, not just in terms of skill, but I would add in terms of confidence and efficacy, right? I really can do this. I've demonstrated capacity before. How many times have we, or it's fascinating when you look at research associated with motivation, how often people are turned off because something at the very beginning didn't sit right. The verbiage was a little bit too sophisticated, it wasn't clear, whatever it was, and they're done. They're not going to try anymore. The notion of perseverance is something that children need to learn. Otherwise, because we're all going to have setbacks, right? We think we're going to have career pathway number one, and how many times do we see that it shifts, right? We're throwing a curveball for whatever the reason. We need to be able to reorient, and we need to be able to think on our toes and do something a little bit different. Okay, any other points here? All right, so this was really great feedback, and I'm going to add to it as well. All right, we talked about already the notion of a small initial investment. I know it came from here somewhere. There, thank you. Right? Yields eventually in long-term results, that students are able to do things and do it better. Okay? There's more confidence, and every time that they engage in the learning, they're doing it at a higher level. They become able to identify what are the key behaviors and strategies that will lead to more successful learning. Right? When you listen at certain times, when you listen to certain words, they're transition words that we use. We'll talk about it a little bit later. Right? The teacher perhaps is going to give a summary or a list. Or perhaps we're shifting from one idea to another. If you're able to really drill down, we can't necessarily focus every moment. It's very hard for us. Right? We're human beings, and we as teachers sometimes forget that. We're going to talk in a moment about the speed at which we speak, and the speed at which our children can write. And that's some of it. And that's assuming that your arm is fully fresh, and you're not in the 5th period of the day. Or even the 5th minute of the 1st period of the day, when you already start to feel a little bit of that fatigue. But besides for the speed of how information is presented, right, what am I really looking for? What are the key ideas? And how do I organize it in a way that I can go back to it later and that it's a valuable resource for me? Okay? And they can also, this is really neat, it's not our topic, but it's worthwhile mentioning quickly, the idea of, by the way, just out of curiosity, how many of you felt that you perked up a little bit more when I said this is really neat? I saw a couple of heads pop up. Okay? I hope you don't mind me pointing to that, but that's really important. Because you sometimes want to say, right, so I asked on the test, you ever have that? And then all of a sudden, right, it's like, that's amazing. You know, everyone has emerged out of their slumber. Okay? Uru yeshenim mishinaschem, right? Okay? So they've awoken because I've given them a point. So students know, you don't have to teach them that one. They know that one. They know that if they hear it that they have to focus. But there are other things students can do that if you don't tell them that they can do it, they may not do it on their own. And that relates often to modalities. So for example, there are people in this room who are really enjoying today because they love oral presentation. And so if I just lecture, talk, that will be maybe fine for them. Maybe. I'm not sure. Okay? Some of you are appreciating the fact that I've given you a visual accompaniment. And you're text readers. You like to see words on paper or on screen. So that's supporting your learning. Maybe when I show you some pictures a little bit later on, we look at graphic organizers, some other things, that will be helpful to you because you'll see it in image. Or you'll see on your paper some of it that I've done in a way where I lay it out. You've got some tables here, things like that. That may help some of your modalities as well. And some of you really like to move. And that's maybe where the Think, Pair, Share help you out a little bit. Now I mention that because you have students in your classroom that are kinesthetic learners. And fortunately, unfortunately, whatever the reason, we may not give them the instruction 90% of the time in a modality that engages them most readily. So what can they do? And it may not have to be something so difficult. It could be something that they squeeze. It could be the ability to pace in the back of the room. It could be the ability to kind of move around a little bit. It doesn't have to be this major to-do, but it can be cooperative learning. It can be, like for example, I actually reference it a lot, so I may as well say it. I used to teach the fourth parak of Brachos, which talks about the time of davening. And it details in that Mishnah different opinions associated with different prayers. And so I had my students, these are 1 foot by 1 foot. I don't know if they still have too many of them around, but Ivy Crown still has them, so I can use them. Okay, my classroom, at the time we had them. And so I made every one of these the equivalent of 30 minutes. I had my students write down on paper. One would say Plaga Mincha, one would say Mincha Ketana, Mincha Gedol, whatever the times would be, and the other one would have the time associated with it, and they literally plotted themselves on a singular class graph, so to speak, or timeline. So, you know, Netzach Hama was standing over here, Shkia was way down there, and everybody else was in between. Now, they didn't have to do it that way. The old conventional way that I do it, I put it over here on the little line, you know, the whole thing, and I would tell them orally as well. Different modalities, different learners, different benefits. Okay? So we try to do it and we need to do it. And a lot of what we're going to do now is ultimately going to be good for us to think about as how we set up our classroom. But the other thing to think about is how can we tell our students that when the modality is not really being addressed, how can they self-advocate? And how do they even know what their modalities are? What are my learning preferences? So sometimes you can say, well, if I get a manual and how to build a bookshelf, what do I look at first? Do I look at the text? Do I look at the pictures? Do I look at the DVD if they give me one? What do I look at? Do I talk it through with somebody? Right? Do I call a friend who's handy? Say, how do you do this? Right? There are different ways we engage. If you're looking for a good tool where you can go online, first of all, I would tell you to self-check. I think it's good for everybody in this room to know what your modalities of preference are, because you probably teach to your modalities. And you probably do it to a disproportionate degree and not even realize it. It's sort of like when they talk about how the NBA superstars, can they be an effective head coach? Right? Can the great quarterback now become a good NFL head coach? Maybe yes, maybe no. What's the concern? If it comes naturally to somebody, they may or may not have the tools by which to explain it and teach it to somebody else. Oftentimes you find that the good head coach was the 10th guy on the bench. Right? Or maybe the catcher. In baseball, it's often the catcher. He's like the field manager, the strong safety, I don't know, whatever it is. But you have somebody who sort of learned to be a coach as he was a ball player. So we have certain modalities, and I bet we often don't even realize how much we favor those modalities in our instruction. So if you go to a website called VARK Learn, I think there's a dash, V-A-R-K, you might be familiar with it. There's a hyphen and then L-E-R-N, I believe, L-E-A-R-N, and I believe it's .org. I think so. You can certainly Google it. VARK stands for Visual Oral, instead of Auditory Oral, but it's the same idea. Read, write, and kinesthetic. It will at least give you feedback about those 4 modalities, which are the 4 main ones. Which are of the 8 identified by Howard Gardner, those 4 are the most commonly found amongst people. And you get a feel for what is your own set of strengths. they'll ask you questions like, you're giving directions to somebody, how are you going to present that information? You'll tell it to them, you'll write it down, you'll draw a picture, you'll put them in your car, you'll take them there, right? What's your approach? And they ask questions like that. Now, if you have your students do the same thing, and there is a child-friendly version of it, you can find it on their website. If you can have them do that same process, all of a sudden they start to realize, the more I listen to the information, the better it'll be. So maybe I should bring a recorder to class. The more I see it in written text, the better it'll be. Can I bring perhaps a laptop to class, or even write it out? But to do it comprehensively, because when I see it, it really goes deeply into my pathways, and my memory becomes much more robust if I do it that way. Right? The more you realize how you learn, the more you can personalize the learning experience in a way that meets your personal needs. Okay? So it's definitely something to think about. All right. Now, who mentioned you mentioned preparation, right? The idea of feeling ready and confident?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, right? Okay. So being physically and emotionally prepared for learning. I have a plan, right? I'm going into it knowing what I'm doing. Being better organized. And I think this last one's also really important. Sometimes we don't take enough time to demonstrate to our students that we really are there to help them succeed. Sometimes we don't. We may feel it. We may think we're expressing it with our non-verbal expressions. Maybe we give a big smiley face on an assignment or a test, and all that's great. All that's wonderful. But do we ever take the time to do more to say, I'm your advocate. I'm here to see you succeed. And when we say to them, I'm going to take a day, even though right now we could be learning content. We could be learning information. We could be doing 20 psukim. We could be doing, who knows what in whichever curricular area we are. But we're going to take some time now to really review core aspects of how you could be a most effective student that also communicates to the children that you are there to help them every step of the way and be most successful. And I would think, I'm assuming that most people share the same sentiment that I have, which is the more you feel that the instructor/teacher is in your corner, the better you feel. I will share with you, I'm in a PsyD program right now. It's the equivalent of a PhD type program. It's all online. I've never met a single professor. But I've engaged with them primarily through either the discussion boards or the email or whatever it might be. There's certain instructors where you know they have your back, where they know that their whole mission is to help you succeed. And there's certain instructors where you feel they can get a little bit nitpicky, kind of like a little, rough around the edges. And I will tell you, it changes my way of engaging with them. And I'm not 12 years old in an elementary school or middle school classroom anymore, right? I'm an adult. I'd like to think I'm relatively mature. At least I'm aspiring. I'm, in that general direction. And I have a couple of years of life under my belt. And I've been a teacher before. And I've been an administrator. I know what it's like. And yet I still feel differently about my own efficacy, my own capacity, my own confidence when I know that the teacher has expressed confidence in me. Expressed a willingness to get behind me and to provide the support. Obviously the teacher can't do it for you. But if the teacher demonstrates that they're prepared to do it with you and give you those foundational skills, then you're really in business. And you feel like you could take risks. A lot of our learning is about risk-taking, right? What happens if I get it wrong? And how many kids will not raise their hand because they took a risk one too many times and it blew up in their face? And they were embarrassed, or they just decided that they can't, right? Ich bin agornished, I can't do it, and I'm moving on to something else, I'm out to lunch, right? But if we're there saying, no, you can't, I expect you to, I have high standards for you, but I'm going to do it in a way that's safe and supportive, you're going to do your students a tremendous service. And frankly, yourselves too, because instead of having the usual 8 to 10 kids that are actively engaged, all of a sudden the number doubles. And right, we love classrooms like that, where everybody's involved.